Hey everyone, welcome to Beyond Ray. Today we're joined by Dr. Isabel Prochner, who's a professor and researcher at Virginia Tech and industrial designer focused on socially and community engaged design. She recently published her second book, Designing for Sex and Gender Equity. This year, she was also nominated for the Industrial Designer Society of America IDSA Young Educator Award. We first became aware of Dr. Prochner's work at the Women in Design Deep Dive, and it really inspired us to set up this season to explore the concept of how design and society shape each other. Dr. Prochner, we're really, really excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's like an absolute pleasure to be here.
My first question is that when you were doing your 2024 deep dive talk, you referred to design and society shaping each other as both a profound problem and a fabulous opportunity. Do you think you could explain what you meant by that?
Well, the idea that design and society shape each other, I think we all kind of know implicitly. I think we kind of understand that. Like we're designing based on what we see. And then what we put out there, is impacting people in like really profound ways. But I think that it's important to call that out and to sort of think about what that means in terms of designers' responsibilities. Because I think that maybe we don't really think about that enough all the time. But having problematic products that get put out there or that don't work the way they're supposed to, or that makes someone feel like their environment isn't built for them is deeply problematic. And then conversely, if you put something out there that makes someone, I don't know, feel a fit or feel seen, especially perhaps if they hadn't felt that way before, I think that's really powerful and one of the best parts of our job or best parts of what design can be. So I was just sort of explaining something that I'd been thinking about and I'd seen other people write about and talk about, but that was the impetus, I think, for my second book.
So since you're also an educator and you encounter a lot of students learning to be designers and you're shaping them, hopefully, in their upcoming careers, how do you see that instinct that design and society are shaping each other manifesting in them? Is that something you notice?
I think so, yeah. And we do really intentionally have a mixture of different projects. And I think that's probably the case at most universities, but definitely at Virginia Tech Industrial Design. We have projects that are deeply socially engaged and engaging with community and really intentionally getting students out of the classroom and talking to the people they're designing for and with. One project that comes to mind is working with a local seniors community group and a local interior design company on some projects. And that is really, really impactful. The students get to propose ideas and speak to members of the community and get feedback and learn. Oftentimes that their first instinct was perhaps not the right one. And then, try something again and get more feedback and just like really learn deeply throughout the process. So we really are conscious about including those kind of projects in class. And I think those are sort of the projects that hit the hardest for the students and that they come away with some of the greatest learning from.
This actually gets to a core question I have about this, which is how well do you think that intention and actual impact correlate in any given project?
I think that impact is probably the most important thing to measure. I think intention, if you have great intentions and it doesn't necessarily come across, that's just too bad, I had read this. There was a great book called Feminist Technologies, and the intro was really, really good. And they were talking about, and I'm just quoting this introduction, but it was something that kind of struck me. And they were saying the first person who invented a tampon, apparently, according to this, had done so with this narrative of just helping women get control of themselves or something like really insulting, but coming up with this really important design that has a really significant impact. So I think that intention perhaps wasn't great, or at least the way that he framed it, whereas the impact is huge. So I think that ideally there would be a combination of impact and outcome, but I think that when it comes down to it, probably outcome is what we should really judge.
I think that's funny because we normally think about that as, well, what if someone had such a great intention, they wanted to help people, but they just were so misinformed and did something terribly wrong, versus it certainly is possible to arrive at a good conclusion even though you have a terrible attitude or like a really problematic view. I suppose we might find at least some of those as we like dive into the past. Something stopped clock.
And I'm not saying Tampon Guy was amazing. Actually, I don't want to say anything good about him, but I think the outcome in that particular case was generally quite positive.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I want to generalize this to other people, but I think it is a good example for sure.
Yeah, the inverse, because Ginger is right. I think if anything, we think that carelessness or potentially bad impact would have a really hard time ending up in a good place. That's so funny. That's nice, honestly. It feels like it's more because the party in question that's being designed for is really good at reclaiming whatever the object is. If you were approaching a team that had worked on a product and they really were like wanting to improve its impact, or they were early stages and they wanted to really have like a great impact when they put it out, what questions would you start asking them to see if they're like on track with a solid approach?
I think who are you talking to? Or who are you learning from would be a really big thing. And also, how are you sort of sharing ideas within the group? Is everyone having a voice in this process? Is everyone empowered to have a voice? Are the people in the group with perhaps the most lived experience in the area the ones who are sharing that or being able to share that? And then who are you designing for, and have you reached out to them? What do you know about them? Is it sort of just this assumption, or have you actually reached out to people? And then if you've done that, sort of what did that look like? Was it just one single person? Was it just purely convenience, or did you really dive deeper? And then also, like, what kind of questions are you asking? Because sometimes I've taught a ton of design research classes. So I've helped students with design research projects and making interview questions and that sort of thing. And it's so easy to have a leading question, a question that kind of guides
a particular outcome. Yeah.
And can kind of make someone want to agree with you or sort of answer something in a really specific way. So I think that it's really important. I would tell them to think really carefully about the kind of questions they ask so that they're not simply confirming what they believe or want to happen. I think that's really important. So I think, I would ask those kind of things and go over that with them for sure.
I noticed that you have mentored roughly 25 undergraduate research assistants. And I didn't even know that there were a lot of undergraduates doing design research. So that was really exciting to come across.
Well, I have something like 11 research assistants at the moment. It's wonderful. It's a lot. When I get money, I like to spend it on people. Like, I want to spend it on students having a little money and also getting something right for their CV and some experience in research as well. So I'm on the Virginia Tech undergraduate research board, actually. So one of the really important things for me is getting undergraduate students some research experience and mentoring them in that, and helping people figure out whether or not they like research is really exciting to me. And when they do like it, it's really nice because you can see them sort of take that on more in their projects. I really like to hire students sort of in the earlier years of their programs as well, like first year, second year, because I think that has a really big impact then the kind of classes they're taking and ultimately like their thesis project and that sort of thing. So I definitely work with a lot of research assistants.
They are so lucky. I think that I would have learned so much if I had that opportunity.
Absolutely.
Oh, well, thank you. It's really fun. And I really do make a point of kind of thinking about what we're working on together so that it's sort of fitting with them, what they seem to be interested in or what they've talked about being interested in, and kind of giving them juicier projects to do, like not something that's just going to be mind-numbing as well.
What an important part of running any sort of internship or like research assistant role, right? That you're like
Yeah.
making it a good job, not one that they run away from.
Yeah.
Do you think you've learned new ways of creating designs with a more positive impact by observing the way that these novice designers or novice researchers come in to the problem and are originally curious about it?
I think that is especially the case when you're thinking of like a capstone project or a thesis project. Because at that point, it's really the students' own. Like we'll create assignments and the students will take it in all sorts of directions and whatever, but it's usually within the parameters of a certain project we've created. So sometimes you have a bit of a sense of what's going to happen, especially when you've taught the class a few times. But when it comes to like a thesis or a capstone, it's the student thinking about everything that they've done over the course of 4 years and creating their own project based on something that they're passionate about and that they see not like being addressed. I think that is really the moment when you learn from students and you also learn more about them as well. That's one of my favorite things to teach, actually, are those kind of classes. And I also teach and continue to teach a lot of courses for students who are minoring in industrial design, and I really enjoy those as well, because there's the industrial design project that's like core in industrial design, and those are amazing. But when it's like a student who is studying nutrition and minoring in industrial design, or studying education and minoring in industrial design, those are just ones where I really do learn, like to a significant degree, because then I'm thinking about, so what is a thesis intersecting with nutrition and industrial design? And it's really can be really surprising and really exciting to sort of learn along with the students and see what they come up with.
So how do you feel that you, as both a design practitioner and an educator, foster the individual voices, that are going through your classes, that perhaps because they would be bringing their unique experience and their other background of their major, or as they make their way towards their capstone where they will have to display a lot of individuality, like, is there something to the curriculum or your classroom management that you think you bring to this that kind of brings out the best in these students?
Well, there's things that a person can do to get students to share their voice. And, I go to lots of teaching conferences and professional development, and that sort of thing. And, some of those, for example, are giving students lots of different ways to communicate their ideas. So maybe it's not verbally in class. Maybe they prefer to text in an answer or email you or write something down or have time to think. So I do all that kind of stuff just to sort of help students to share their thoughts in whatever way works best for them. But I mean, there's lots of things that we do as a program and as a school to highlight different voices. So for example, and I think that is really impactful for students when they see someone that maybe speaks to them or that maybe has a similar experience to them. They see representation and they see that the field can be lots of different things. I think that's really exciting. So last week, for example, we had a health and wellness symposium, which was really fun. So it was all about studio culture and getting the students to think about who they are as designers and how they can sort of be healthy in school and be healthy, as they transition to the workplace. And we had a former student of mine, Jake DeHaan, come in, and he works at Gensler now in interior design. He does presentations and he identifies as deaf, queer, and neurodivergent. And he talked a lot about that and his identities and sort of how he brings that to his practice. And I think that those kind of things are really important parts of programs and really valuable for students to see. And they can kind of be like, yeah, there's all sorts of really wonderful things you can do in design.
That sounds like a really nice design studio to be in.
Absolutely. Yeah, share your voice and that sort of stuff. Thanks.
Yeah, it's not hammering this like pull all-nighters every night thing that is such a trope of design school.
We're trying not to. We're actively fighting it. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like maybe it's already happening just because you're showing them a variety of ways to be and supporting identities. But how do you teach your students like a healthy skepticism of the status quo that's already operating in our design world or in the information that's handed down to them even in their education?
Oh, I think that's a really big thing that well, I am very skeptical about a lot of things. I think it always comes up eventually. For example, I co-authored a paper that's coming out in January in Design Issues, the journal, and it's talking about sort of a challenge of design personas, from a research and a stereotype and, all that sort of stuff perspective.
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot about those kind of things. So I address them in my classes, and my colleagues and I talk about them as well. I teach classes where it actively comes up. Well, maybe not so much about design personas, but I've recently taken over the big design history classes in
Nice.
industrial design because I enjoy it, but also because I have this really strong opinion about what we should include in a design history class. And that's kind of breaking from the canons or like specific or traditional ways of telling history. And I've been trying to broaden it and change how we think about design history. And one of the exciting things about that is it happens in the first year.
Yeah.
Our students are taking it in their first semester or the second semester. And I like to think that it's going to set them up for having these conversations going forward and thinking critically about some of the things that are maybe taken for granted in design education.
Who are some of the people, or like what are the movements that come up in your design history class versus the very classic ones?
Ooh, so I teach two, one of which is a history of design before it would have been called industrial design. So thinking about all sorts of like kind of creative movements over thousands of years. And then the second one, which I teach in the spring semester, so starting in January, is a history of industrial designers. So focusing on specific people. And I try to highlight more voices and people who have maybe been left out. So I was doing some reading and found, there's the women of the Bauhaus, but there's also this wonderful history of folks from Japan traveling to Germany and studying at the Bauhaus. And we talk about them in class. We look at their work. We look about how they interpreted their different cultures and education systems and sort of what they did with these ideas in their practice. We talk about, for example, Charles Harrison. I believe he was the first, one of the first African-American industrial designers. He worked at Sears. He designed some really, really, really large number of products for Sears. I think it was like 500 different things.
Whoa.
That was huge. There was a biography that was published a few years ago, for example. So we talk about that sort of thing as just a few examples.
Your students are lucky. Is my main takeaway. Sheesh.
I really enjoy what I do. It's really fun.
It's obvious.
Yeah.
You are so passionate about it. Yeah.
Another class I wish I could have taken. Like, our design history class was okay, but it was a little bit too traditional. I must have known that very early on, and it was a very sleepy class for me, unfortunately.
Oh, very sleepy, yeah. One of the fun things, I think, as a designer and an educator is I can design my classes, and I teach them every year, so you can iteratively improve them every year and figure out what's not working or what's boring people or, that sort of thing. And I get to keep adding to them and trying out interesting things. So that's fun.
You've already started answering this, but can you list a few really specific things you do to shape curriculum in a typical studio class so that students have the best chance at creating a really thoughtful product? Like maybe early on in prototyping classes or something where the time frame isn't even that long.
I teach a capstone class in the spring this year, and I've taught it before. At my previous institution, I worked at Syracuse University. I'm planning to employ something kind of similar. And it can be hard for students to carry out a project from start to finish, especially a capstone project where they're structuring it themselves and they're sort of leading it. So I kind of created this framework that students work from. And every week there's a goal and they meet the weekly goal and they do like a little check-in and that sort of thing. But making sure that a week's goal is something as kind of simple as reflecting upon what you would like to do and kind of writing a few things, or a week's goal would be conducting some research or going out and talking to people. So sort of really building that into the project, making sure that they spend a lot of the beginning parts of the project being reflective and kind of being encouraged to do that and almost kind of required to do that. I think that's really important. So making sure that they don't jump in too quickly is really important, and making sure that sometimes students will know what they want to do before the project even starts. Like they'll know, I want to make a chair or an app. It's usually an app, and sort of the whole project will sort of mold to that goal. And I try to kind of not let that happen and sort of ask questions along the way and make sure that they're really listening to what the project is requiring or the research is saying to sort of, yeah, so that they kind of engage in that more.
That makes sense. The pressure of them, I think, probably doing something that like they just want it to look a really particular way in their portfolio, right? Probably shoves them away from a wider range of project opportunities that they could tackle.
That's a good point. I think that a lot of projects can end up being beautiful or being opportunities to showcase skills. I tried this thing a few years ago, which was surprising projects, kind of giving students projects that they didn't know the answer to before it started, and really that kind of forced research and kind of forced engagement in sort of critical thinking and that sort of thing. And then in the end, it can be whatever they want it to be, and they can showcase all their beautiful skills and make a beautiful portfolio piece. But also sort of requiring them to really think about what the project is telling them and the people are telling them. So one project was the futures of pest control. That was a project I did with my grad students a few years ago, and it was sort of, it was based on local news stories about a building, like a public housing building that had been having some pest control issues, and it was on the headlines, and it was very timely. But also, I don't know if the students or a lot of people would have a lot of insights in sort of how to address that issue, which is really complex. So we did that, and they did their research, and I think they came up with stuff that they would have never have sort of imagined starting out.
That's a really cool project.
That process kind of like, I want to say, puts a lot of pressure on the research, but it doesn't feel like that's correct in the sense that even if you feel you know something well, you should still do research, right? So when people do know something really, really well, how do you like break them away from their assumptions and all the things that they might like want to take shortcuts and force them to do the better research and come to new insights?
I know my experience reasonably well, like my own life experience, but I mean, it's pretty specific to me and pretty specific to the really, really precise context in which I'm living. So I think that it would be really hard to sort of extrapolate and assume that someone is having a similar experience to me. And I think I would just talk to my students about that and sort of make sure that they're checking in with members of their community or friends or whoever maybe has other insights on kind of what's going on with them, and sort of just take it as a given that their experience probably isn't going to be something that's shared super widely in the grand scheme of things. Yeah.
I feel it's really topical because today my company's doing a project with students. So we had a check-in today, and we're later in the quarter. So they're coming up with their beautiful work now. They've done a lot of research, but the beginning is a push where you don't want to like give them answers, but you also like sometimes need to point out maybe not quite that, maybe like a little more here and look into this.
I mean, that's exactly what we should be doing. That's exactly the point. So that's amazing.
It's hard. Like, I think the easy answer is when you just feel like, well, I could just tell you this because like I think I'm right, but that's still not really a sound process and not the best for their education.
No, they need to figure stuff out and try out their ideas, and maybe their idea is going to work. Like it usually does, honestly. And just let them show you or kind of prove you wrong. I think that's one of the really fun things. Is I absolutely love when students prove me wrong or ask me really hard questions like that. That's what makes it fun. Yeah, and if they try out some way of prototyping, for example, that I would never have imagined. I mean, honestly, it usually works fabulously.
Wow. How do you balance like being a really strong leader that they know they can like put their faith in to guide them through this very important education that they're getting, and then also being like, really, really humble and aware that they're going to teach you as much as you teach them, right? Like, where do you land on a day-to-day and the way that you show up and the way that you present knowledge, like as coming from them, coming from you? Does that make sense?
I hope I do it right or well. I think I am, though. I did get that Young Educator Award you talked about earlier. So
Yeah, you did.
I hope I'm doing it well. But I think that it just is obvious when you need to intervene or when you need to give feedback. For example, I'm doing some grading at the moment, and we're sort of pretty far along in the semester, honestly. So I had given, feedback all along and kind of sent them off. They're doing their projects and they're all super confident and they have these wonderful ideas. And I'm looking at the work now and you can see that they have questions and maybe they don't know where to go. And you can also see in the work that they've showed there's absolutely stuff I can comment on and I am commenting on it. So I think sometimes it just it appears and becomes kind of obvious, kind of their cycles, and students will kind of go away and they'll come back, and you sort of know, okay, at that point, this is the moment to kind of have that conversation. I think also they're probably more open to it at that point as well, because they actually know they have questions and they do have questions, whereas maybe they didn't before.
Mm-hmm. They would really like you to jump in and help, right? Because they're sort of like confused about an area.
Yeah,
sure.
Probably. Yeah,
that makes sense. So you've talked a fair bit about, how you would set up a curriculum. What are some of the key steps to setting up a new research project? You're getting going, you're like laying the foundation for what you're going to jump into. And what are sort of beginning?
I'm doing one right now, which is big for me. I do a lot of research projects, but what I'm doing right now is, I'm researching chest binders. I've been doing that for a while. That was inspired by, there was this project called the Binding Health Project that was done, I think it's in 2014, so 10 years ago now. And it was showing that 97%, I think, of people who bind their chests using chest binders have these physical side effects, which are ranging from itching to trouble breathing to rib fractures in some cases. So that, as a designer, is really marking, and you're thinking about this product that possibly hasn't been given a lot of thought, certainly doesn't have enough oversight.
Right.
Or, structures to make sure that it's being designed well or, safe for folks. So that's something that I've been thinking about for a while. And now I'm putting together this team to look at the health of people who bind, pain, and also some of the positive side effects of binding, and aiming to sort of come up with some guidelines on how to sort of maximize the good, minimize the negative, and also some design insights in terms of like what aspects of binders end up being great and what aspects of binders end up maybe being associated with some of the side effects. For example, is it the shoulder straps or the placement of the shoulder straps or the material, or maybe certain cuts more than others, or maybe something about the aesthetics just makes someone feel really great about what they're wearing, or makes them feel not good about what they're wearing. So I think those are really interesting questions as a designer. So I'm building this team. It's probably the biggest project I've done, and it's 15 people, multidisciplinary, so doctors, social worker, family therapist, biomedical engineer, all that sort of stuff. So we're kind of bringing it together, and it's sort of slow at points and also sort of shockingly fast at other points, where it's kind of gathering momentum, and we're coming up with these really interesting ideas.
That's an incredible project. Yeah. I know somebody who has been really excited recently by using like a specific type of tape that's really good for binding, which has been cool. It seems to be just like anecdotal experience where they have said that it's like really comfortable and they can keep it on for a long time without feeling scared about the damage, which is cool to see. I love that there's people innovating.
There's a few brands. I think there's Trans Tape, and then there's a few other ones out there. Yeah. I don't know if there's ever actually been any studies. These products, long term.
And we can tell how vital that product is because people are going to the lengths of having, get injuries from it. And so it's so crucial that there's a better version of it and a like more studied version of it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so do you think yet what is the life after the research once it's completed and published? Is it something that you think consumers are going to read, that companies are going to cite? Like, how is it going to spread, and like how is it going to get used? Is it hard to say until it happens?
Well, for this particular project, we're aiming for public health guidelines. So something that physicians could employ, but also that could be communicated to people through maybe public health guidelines that might be on social media or somewhere that people are actually going to be able to access them. And sort of saying, you need to do this. How can we make this better? How can we make this safer for you, or make this a more positive experience for you? I think that's kind of the outcome. And there's so many new binding products on the market, like you mentioned the tapes, but there's all sorts of new companies coming out. So rather than necessarily designing something myself, I had kind of thought about that for a while, but I want to kind of understand out of what exists, out of the many, many, many new companies out there, is there maybe a direction that's proving to be a little bit better than others, or are there certain design features that are amazing? And why isn't everyone employing them? Or conversely, are there certain things that people are doing without really realizing that they could change? Maybe it's the material, maybe it's the cut, maybe it's something like that, that probably from a design perspective would actually be fairly easy to change, but would make such an impact on people. So I think that's sort of the goal.
That makes sense. I mean, to Ginger's general point, my assumption is that our industry is not amazing about incorporating research
No.
into the products. Why do you think that gap is so big in industrial design when other fields have sort of figured it out better? And how do you think we could get better at companies and people making products actually leaning on research that people like you are doing?
Research is expensive.
Mm.
Research takes time. And research can point you in unexpected directions. And that's one of the really wonderful things I find actually about teaching my classes is I really encourage my students to listen to what it's telling them and to kind of go in these directions that they maybe weren't expecting. And that can be, I think, really scary for a company and really potentially dangerous for a company to do. So I think those are part of the reasons.
Yeah.
But I think that there are ways to do research or ways to just sort of observe that maybe are easier to adopt. And I think that's just like what I was saying of if you only have so much time to ask a few questions and ask a few people, like make sure that you're asking good questions and choosing good people, not just the people who are easy to access, and who maybe think like you, like going and finding people who are maybe going to disagree and figuring out why. But I think that other research can be harder to employ. But I don't think that my research for the binders, for example, is going to be difficult to employ. They just got to wait a little while till we actually do it. Like, because I want this to be like super solid data and data that we can trust because it needs to be.
Yeah.
It's really important that it is. So it'll take a little while for us to get it. But I think that one of my goals as a researcher is to do projects that are things that people can that can be digested,
Sure,
are concrete and sort of accessible in some ways. Like that is something that I love doing with my books, for example. I really want them to be something that's interesting and that people will read. My third book that I'm working on right now, it's revisioning the Henry Dreyfus Associates measure of man and woman for 2024 or whatever decade we're in. And I think that is research, but that is also stuff that is hugely and directly applicable and really easily applicable. So that's what I like to do.
That makes sense. It sounds mostly like you're talking about things people could incorporate without having to sacrifice the business idea that they originally had that kind of got them going. And that makes sense because, yeah, I wish that more corporations were willing to take the risk of their product like not being the right answer or like needing to make a big expensive pivot. But we do function in a field that's very, very impacted by being, corporate and incorporated with business. Yeah, it's just a really hard reality to swallow at times, I think.
In my second book, Designing for Sex and Gender Equity, I'd interviewed a lot of people who had these really interesting and wonderful design ideas. And one of the sort of striking things was the number of those projects that were crowdfunded and that were sort of entrepreneurial ventures by the people who created them. So I think that sometimes if you have an amazing idea, it needs to happen in other ways. And it's encouraging to know that there are people who are that passionate and feel that strongly about their projects that they're doing it and they're finding success doing it that way.
Absolutely. I'm also curious, you mentioned that in the binder project in particular, you were debating temporarily, should I do this or should I research this and give it to more people? How do you generally decide if you are actually going to be the person that works on a product, since you have both of these skills that are so well developed?
I think for the binder project, I just felt I didn't have enough information to design something. I think there's just so much that's unknown. that I just wasn't feeling in a position to be putting something out there, and feeling that it was going to necessarily be any better than anything that was already out there. Like I have ideas about what I think would be really valuable, but like I haven't spoken to that many people, that sort of thing. And then also, do I have some of the medical research to sort of back that up and make sure that I'm not putting something out there that's just going to make things worse? That was basically what stopped me. And I was thinking, no, I need to do the research first, and I need to see, if we're going to do this, how do we do this right? That was what I was thinking. And then in the meantime, there are all these wonderful new companies that have come out and new products that have come out when I've been thinking about this for a few years. So now it's kind of transitioned to being, okay, so we're going to have the research probably sooner than later. And then maybe we can use that to look at what's out there and look at, what we can learn from it, or what we can maybe point people towards.
I think one of the things that can be scary for companies doing research is that it feels like you can always keep researching. So how do you feel like you're done with it? Like you maybe know enough from your research about chest binders to then go ahead and make one. Do you have some benchmarks or good ways to establish those milestones?
Maybe when you stop being surprised would be a good one. Sort of when you're talking to people and you start getting what they're telling you and expecting certain answers and getting that, I think that would be a good benchmark. That's called data saturation, I think. That's a really good thing. And in the binder project and in the human factors book project I'm doing, everything I hear is exciting and new to me at this point, so I'm not done at all. I still have a long ways to go, but I think that's a really big thing. Like when you're talking to people and you keep getting things that surprise you, I think you need to keep going because you don't know what's still around. But also sometimes you can reach this point of hearing something again and something really being kind of hammered in as a point. Sometimes that can happen pretty quickly also. And I think that if you get to that point and that seems solid, I think that it would probably be pretty good to go ahead with that.
That must be fun though. Like a thing that you can do for work every day and feel like for days on end, you keep learning something new that it's surprising.
I like that. I think I've chosen my job well. Yeah, I really love that. And I like having a few projects going on at the same time as well, so I can kind of switch between and truly be able to jump between really cool projects. And yeah, it's a pleasure, really.
Short of people not doing research, where does research really go wrong? Or do you have any examples of people trying to do it and then doing it in actually a damaging way?
I think I would reiterate some of the things I've said before.
Yeah.
So if you're framing questions in a way that forces people to answer them in a certain way, if you're only talking to specific people, if you're not listening to them as well, that's a really huge thing. You're not actually engaging with what they're saying. That can be really damaging and a waste of time for honestly everyone involved.
Yeah.
I think, a lot of the sort of things I've already said, those are, I would say, faux pas for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's the same things that happen with your students that, of course, are just true for research generally. What about the line between thoughtful, well-incorporated research and just actually doing co-design or co-creation? How are those different from each other? And when is one more appropriate than the other?
There's different levels, I think, of co-design. And I had done a fair bit of reading, like, of the theory of that, because I had used that in my dissertation. And I've given a few talks on it. So if I'm recalling correctly, it's been a year or two since I've thought about it, but sometimes when you're doing co-design, it's bordering on kind of like an action research or like community-based participatory research. Like there's these other words, and it's just basically this idea that the people you're working with are truly your partners. And they're empowered in the same way that you're empowered to drive the project. So you're bringing them in early, you're making major decisions together, and they're involved to a higher degree in the project. So I think that is hugely different from just research where you as a designer are going out and talking to people and you're bringing it back to your team. But I think there's this huge spectrum basically between co-design, where the people that you're working with are your partners, and sort of like this extractive research that we don't want to be doing anymore, where you're kind of going and you're taking information and the people that you're working with really aren't getting anything in the process and are maybe being harmed in the process. I think that there's all these other places where you can be along this spectrum. So you can just do research that makes people feel good and that you give them a positive experience while you're talking to them, and it's just pleasant and it's quick and you get what you need, but y'all have a nice time doing it. Like that's good too. You can do co-design where you're meeting with someone and you're talking with them, and maybe it's just like 1 or 2 sessions, or you could do co-design and it's really, really involved. And I think all of these are actually really great. And one of the nice things is you can kind of choose where you sit along. I don't think anyone's really ever telling you which one you have to choose, but it's just sort of like who your partners are and your resources and your time and sort of what makes sense for the project.
That's so interesting. I think that it does make sense. It's a spectrum, but personally, for that like far end of, I guess, like the true co-design where you have empowered partners, I have a hard time seeing like designers at a lot of in-house outlets and big corporations having the authority to yield, because that's basically what it is sort of saying, you as a design partner outside of me, outside of my group, have impact on the decisions, or like even veto. You can stop things you are adding to this process. And I don't know, like even in my own role, if we were to co-design with people in our community, we don't have the authority to give them, there's someone above our heads cutting checks and writing
Absolutely.
timelines.
And it needs to be authentic as well. And that's the thing too. Like if you're going to bring people into the project and that's the idea, it needs to actually be authentic and actually happen.
Is there ever a downside of trying to really co-design with a community and then not crediting or compensating them sufficiently for the like extreme amount of information that they pour into the project?
That would be awful. Yeah, and that's historically, that is absolutely historically what's happened, right? And there's all these awful stories of research done terribly wrong in the past. Absolutely. Yeah, that would be a worst case scenario. That would be awful.
Is it like hard to get away from that stuff just because it's been done before? Because like I think I have a feeling, just based on like my own work and who I've communicated with, that if something's been done before, when you have a precedent, right, then like people tend to follow it. What are ways that you break from that? I guess skepticism is like your attitude towards them, right? What are some concrete steps that you use to change people's minds about things that have been done before?
Well, there's these great structures. For example, at the university, there's institutional review boards. So if I want to do research, I would write up a proposal and it would be reviewed by a large group of peers, and they would give me instructions and things to change, and I would be bound by that. And I think that is a direct response to really problematic research projects in the past. So having structures like that in place are really valuable. And I think just understanding probably why they're so important, it's hard to argue with if you sort of understand the implications of not following, and just also the implications of people involved in the research. They're going to have had a negative experience. They're not going to want to collaborate again.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, it's just a bad scenario all around. And I, like when I teach design research classes, I taught one every year for 5 years, or, whatever it is. We always talk about that. And I think it's important to explain, or not just say, don't do it, but also to explain why don't do it. And then you can kind of see it on people's faces when you explain the why. They're like, okay. Yeah. And I hopefully that's something that people carry forward. And I do think that they do. I mean, my students, they really do try to be responsible in their research, and you can see that it's really important to them.
That's wonderful. I mean, I think it's so important that you're working with young people, right? And sort of getting a jump on the way that they're coming into our field. I guess I would love to know how designers that are already really established within a corporation, and like we mentioned before, have that pressure of like business or like other impacts coming in. How can they keep each other accountable to make moral, ethical decisions and really prioritize the user?
I think it's like change from within. I think, that's probably the thing. I mean, that's honestly probably why I'm doing my job too. I saw a way that I think design should be taught, and I'm doing it, and
Yeah,
you sort of moderate it for the needs. But I think that's what you two are doing as well. And I think that that's what designers should absolutely do. They should have a strong opinion about how their work should go, or maybe how certain things should go. Maybe there are certain things that are really important to them. And I think the biggest thing is just kind of standing up for that in whatever way is possible in the moment. And it's not always going to be possible, but sometimes it is. And in those moments where you do have the power, I think you should take it. And that's exciting. And like motivating each other to do better. That was another part of your question. I think like having communities like this podcast or the IDSA Women in Design, you're meeting other people who are thinking about similar things to you and kind of reinforcing that the sort of things that are important to you are legitimately important and are important to other people, and you can share ideas. And I mean, that's so important. And also finding allies and people who sort of will stick up for you.
absolutely.
It's really nice.
Yeah, sometimes the designers that we encounter are the only designers at their workplace. And there's a lot of places where it's like that lean workplace and they're not huge teams. And so maybe some self-reliance or seeking outside the workplace to perpetuate and build good values. But you do work on a lot of cross-disciplinary teams for your research. And so like, do you find that like you can easily find those allies in those other disciplines? And like, how do you bring it out? Or do they just have very different motivations that they're kind of answering to?
I think you're learning from each other in those kind of projects. I think everyone is a specialist in their area. Like when I'm doing these projects, I'm the designer. Like for the binder project, I'm not a medical doctor whatsoever, but I learn and I'm like really interested in learning. And then the medical doctors, for example, probably don't know much about design and they're going to learn as well. So I think the key thing is finding teams or building teams, because you get to build the team and choose who you're working with, is actually choosing people who are going to respect you and listen and maybe not necessarily like agree on everything, right? Or kind of understand the same things that you do, but you want to choose people who are going to stick up for you or push you in interesting ways. So yeah, finding people who are going to bring out the best in you, basically.
The struggle continues in-house. I'm just kidding. I love my coworkers. They're great.
Do you think designers are particularly well set up to have the skill set that we're talking about of like recruiting more people to this type of work or to like be attentive about the impact?
I think that it depends on the scale. I think that, I mean, as long as people are thinking about it, I honestly would consider that a win. I think just sort of being aware of issues and like whatever issues a person's interested in, maybe that's sustainability or social justice or whatever, as long as they're thinking about it and kind of thinking sometimes about how their work may or may not support that, and maybe occasionally being able to make a decision that kind of aligns with what's really important to them. I think that's a win, honestly. That would be a win for me. But I think anything more is amazing. But I, like that's kind of what I think about from my books, and the kind of things I write. Like if someone reads it and it just causes them to think differently about like even one thing, I think that is a triumph. I think like when I'm talking about this sort of thing, I'm not necessarily meaning huge scale change. I think that would be really neat if it happened. but also that like small scale change can be huge.
Yeah.
When I teach classes, sometimes students are going to come away with these huge learnings, and other times students are maybe just going to come away with like one thing. And I think that sometimes just the one thing is great also.
Absolutely. This is sort of a blue sky question, but something I really appreciate about you is that you seem really optimistic and forward looking. Like you really invest a lot of energy into just making positive change. Could you tell us a little bit about a future you imagine if we all do really succeed in like creating a lot of these positive feedback loops with our customer users and research?
I don't think it's going to happen.
Not optimistic. All right.
I'm not optimistic. I don't think it's going to happen, but like you have to hope, right?
That's not what I expected. Amazing.
I would love it if it did. But that's what I mean about small changes. Like I truly don't think it's going to happen.
Mm.
But if just one thing goes on a little bit better than before, or just one more person is involved in decision making, or if somebody is thinking about someone's rights or how someone uses like a product and they weren't thinking about it before, I think that's good. It would be great if it was more, but it probably won't be.
But even understanding that you feel that way about it, it's really actually awesome that you still dedicate so much of your time to this work. Like everything doesn't have to change for the effort that you're putting in to be worthwhile or for the users.
No, I'll just keep doing my thing.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I have visions of what would be amazing, but it probably won't happen.
No, this is totally like words to live by. I think it's easy to get caught up in sort of a hero fantasy that you could do one great thing and change the world, but most things aren't like that. So doing little things here and there and just doing it because it's the right thing to do. And then eventually that's how things change over like a super long scale of time. But that's the right like way to approach it. Just like keep doing your thing.
Along.
But if anyone has ideas about more short-term change, count me in. I would love to be part of planning that too.
Someone fill us in on the revolution.
Yeah, I think realistically speaking, it's going to take a while.
Oh gosh, I love it. Well, we're sort of wrapping up. I want to give you an opportunity to share anything that you think maybe we didn't cover. And then I've got one more fun question for you.
Ooh. I really don't think I have anything else, but like it's just been so nice talking with you all. And yeah.
Absolutely. You too. So this season, the way that we want to wrap up each episode, we're inspired by, Dieter Rams' principles of good design. But as you already established, you're teaching design history in a different way. We're looking a little deeper. And we thought it would be a really fun exercise to create a new set of rules that reflect the time we're living in and the wider range of designers' perspectives of today. So is there a principle that you'd like to add to our new list or update from the old list?
That's kind of hilarious because I've literally written a manifesto against Dieter Rams' principles of good design. And it's under review for publication at the moment. And I've also given a talk in New York Design Week about that. Yes. So I do not like his principles of good design. Like they're so 60s objectivist, masculine. I think small steps, ditch them. Maybe that's not a small step. Anyways, I'm sorry that I have very strong feelings about Dieter Rams.
This is great.
Okay, good. Actually, it's an assignment I give my students. So in my history class and in other classes I've done, I taught an ethics class at one point. We look at his principles and we talk about them. We talk what's awesome. And then we also talk about like good design is, and who is he to say good design is? And then I'll tell my students, you have as much right as Dieter Rams to say what good design is. And then they make their own principles and, it's usually good design is accessible, community-oriented, fun, fabulous, extravagant, and kind of like thinking about how there aren't just 10, there's probably 1,000, and they're probably highly contradictory.
Sure, from one another.
Good design is extravagant and festive and full of glitter, but also sustainable. So that's probably not meshing super well, but I think that it can be all of those things.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow, I think it's crazy that we stumbled across something that you do already. Fun.
It's a fun assignment. And yeah, I have a paper under review. It's been about a year, so I should follow up on what happened to it.
Hopefully we can release that little, coming soon in our show notes too.
That'd be hilarious, yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry to not approve of Dieter Rams. I hope that doesn't mess up.
No,
it doesn't.
Kind of the point of this question that, we think it's silly too. Those rules are really outdated, and it's just one more example of like many of the things that we're all lugging around about the way we should approach design and the way we all have to look and be and feel about our work that just only serve a pretty specific population and way of thinking.
Yeah, let me ponder what I have said about Dieter Rams in the past. Okay, one thing I have to say about it is I think people put words in his mouth. I think they see his principles and they think that they're a lot broader than they really are. I think that they were written very specifically. Like when he says good design is aesthetic, I believe that's one of them. It's not any aesthetic. It's the Rams aesthetic, right? I mean, like, I think that people can interpret it to be a lot of things, and it would be great if good design is aesthetic could include faux fur, but it doesn't. And so I think also I have to say I've done a lot of research on Dieter Rams and watched his interviews and really recent interviews as well. And he also, I think, is calling for people to ditch the principles, because he, in a lot of his more recent talks, has talked about, you know, we need to reorient ourselves as a profession. We need to focus more on sustainability. I really wish, you know, the new generation of designers would be rethinking what we do. And like, I take that to be a sign that Dieter Rams is kind of calling for us to change it up a little bit.
He gets it. Even he is like, I wrote this a long time ago. Maybe there's a new version that would be better.
Yes, actually, I gave a talk at an exhibition for his 90th birthday. And the prompt for the talk was, what do we do now? Or like, what's next in terms of what do we mean by good design for today? That was like the most fun prompt ever to sort of think about, while also being respectful of Dieter Rams and how he was of his time and fabulous for his time.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for your answer. That's really fun. I want to think about more faux fur.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for coming and chatting with us today. This is a really exciting way to kick off, you know, a conversation that we hope to keep having over the next several months with our community. We're going to share, I think, links to a lot of your research so people can find your work. Is there a way that you would love people to reach out to you, connect, or follow along with what you're doing if they're curious about you?
Connect with me on LinkedIn. You can talk there or send me an email. You can find me on the Virginia Tech website. It's just Isabel Prochner, and, you know, send me an email there. I'd absolutely love to talk.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again. We feel really, really grateful for your time and all of the impacts that you're having on your students and research in general in our field.
Thank you so much. It was very fun. And I don't always get that much of an opportunity to share my own opinions. Sometimes it's, you know, I'm teaching a very specific class, but it's really just fun to chat about this kind of thing.
Absolutely.
We love it. We could have gone all night, I think.
Thanks for listening to this month's episode of Beyond Ray Season 3. You can find all our past episodes on beyondraypodcast.com. If you had thoughts about this episode, you can weigh in on our most recent Instagram post at @wid_Seattle.